Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine. I'm a research librarian at the Mount Prospect Public Library. I want to welcome you to tonight's program, Basics of Landscape Design. Tonight's program is actually the first in a year-long gardening series we are doing to celebrate the library's new seed library. That's on the first floor of our main branch. If you're not familiar with it, haven't seen it, the way it works, you don't need a library card to take seed packets. We just ask that you take only what you need, and it's on a first come, first serve basis. There was a flurry of people taking packets when we first unveiled it in November, but we have recently restocked it with a couple seeds in all of the varieties. So there's vegetables, perennials, natives, and herbs. And we'll do another restock in February. So if you are interested, please feel free to check that out. It is in one of those old style card catalogs on the first floor. A couple more housekeeping things for tonight before we get started. I am recording tonight's program, and it will be posted to the library's YouTube page for a period of time. It will be posted in about 3 to 4 business days, so if you just Google Mount Prospect Public Library YouTube, it should be one of the first results that you see. There is a handout that I emailed out earlier today. If you didn't get the email or went to spam and you didn't see it, I will put it in the chat later on tonight. But if you don't get a chance to download it or don't see the email, just contact the library and I'll make sure to get that to you. If you have any questions throughout the night, please put those in the Q&A feature at any point throughout the evening. We will take all questions at the end, but put those in as you think of them. And then if you have any comments or technology issues, please put that in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat throughout the night. And then after tonight's program, I'm going to send out a short anonymous survey via email. We would really appreciate any feedback that you have. So thank you so much in advance for filling out that survey. I think that's all the housekeeping things I have. So with that, I want to welcome our presenter for tonight's program, Mark Dwyer. Mark has spent years working in garden centers and botanical gardens. He was the director of horticulture at the Rotary Botanical Gardens in Janesville, Wisconsin for 21 years, where he oversaw the maintenance and development of 20 acres of land. He has consistently been involved with private landscape design, both residential and commercial, for over 25 years and has been educating the public on horticultural topics and gardening topics through hundreds and hundreds of presentations. Mark enjoys keeping up to date on landscape design and the use of innovative plant materials and design features, focusing on beauty, form, and function. And that's what he's here tonight to teach us all about. So thank you so much for being here, Mark. Thank you all for coming, and I will now turn over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Catherine. Well, good evening, everyone. This will be an exciting topic on a pseudo wintry day. In Janesville today, it was around 40 degrees, and that previous snow we had is mostly melted down. So if you're in the Chicago area, which I'm sure you are, incidentally, I grew up in Villa Park, Illinois. So I was a suburban boy and went to the University of Illinois and have family still back in the Chicago area. So I appreciate you being here tonight. And we've got a topic that we'll address in a little over an hour and leaving some time for questions. And to Catherine's point, do feel free to enter those questions in. And I will include my personal email at the end of this talk, and it's on the handout as well. If you do have questions beyond tonight, if you think of something later, don't hesitate to reach out. It's a broad topic with a lot of content, and so we'll brush over a whole bunch of ideas and thoughts. I think most importantly to consider is in terms of landscape design, we jump right into the question of what plant should I put where? And while that's valid, there's a lot of other considerations to keep in mind as you create a new landscape, redevelop a landscape, or maybe you have a maturing or matured landscape and you're considering some modifications and changes. So we'll dive right in. I'll go at a pretty good clip. Your handout has quite a few of the verbiage that you'll see in the primary points if you decide to nab that at some point. But all these words on the left, I won't bore you by reading it, but in essence, what we're saying is landscaping is creating spaces and function. It's using your outdoor space to provide a service, certainly beauty, maybe there's fragrance, pollinator potential, all the things we want our plants to do. but we do want spaces that become useful, attractive, and complement the home. In this instance, on the right, there's no front yard, it's all garden. Inherently, of course, that's quite a bit of maintenance. So we do have to be careful on how quickly we develop our spaces. It has to go hand in hand. Development goes hand in hand with the understanding of maintenance needs, because all too often we bite off more than we can chew, and I've been part of that for many years. I seem to do that every year. So um, this is the type of thing I've done for 30 years now. Little two-dimensional sketches. This is just a small little layout for the front of a home. This is old school pencil on vellum. When I went to the University of Illinois, they were just starting to get AutoCAD programs. So it was old school vellum, which I still use. But the idea here is, what do these little symbols and circles translate to? What is this two-dimensional rendering create for the person that's living in a three-dimensional reality? And fancy symbols and lettering don't necessarily equate to a good design. This is a decent design, I'll be honest, but the approach with this is transferring these proposals into reality. So whether you're getting professional help, a designer to do some work for you, or you're out in your landscape scratching your head and making some sketches, it's important to understand how your landscape development will work for you. Because our landscapes are a work of art, but they're fluid. They're always changing. Plants are always growing. Seasonal transitions. It's not a painting. It's a constantly in motion, as we all know. And so going back to the maintenance, we do need to understand that. So just some examples of the type of stuff I still do on the side. I do have a day job, but I don't know how many of these I've done where I have to admit, out of school, I took what I would call as it was a cookie cutter job, where I was at a landscape firm where we could only use plants that were in the nursery, and we were constantly pressured to use certain plants just to get them out there, and we were also pressured to jam them closer together to sell more plants. So there was, I'm not saying this is common in the industry, but the reality was creativity was curtailed because of some of these limitations, and that's why I left that situation and got into botanic gardens, because I could nab any types of plants and have a lot of fun with them and really get to know the plants, which really is the crux of a beautiful landscape. But again, there's so much we can do in advance before even putting a plant in the ground. So, again, these little sketches, this was for our local YWCA, has an outdoor garden that I designed. You'll see, here's some colored pencil. As you look closely, there are areas of turf and patios and seating and arbors in a very narrow spot, but that plant list on the left, again, is the icing on the cake in terms of creating a beautiful space. And this is actually a preliminary design for the garden I currently manage, which is a 3-acre healing garden at a local hospital. I did this 15 years ago, and oddly enough, I'm back managing it and maintaining it with volunteers. This is my home garden, so this is my idea of a full landscape. My little 1919 bungalow in Janesville, Wisconsin. We have 2 adult daughters, lots of animals at home, and we've planted all the way to the curb. And we now have a grandson. We've had to carve out some space for play out in the backyard, but this subtropical, lush, chaotic mess is how I garden. So don't let people tell you how to garden. Oddly enough, the lady who used to live in that red house off left there called the city on us many times, complaining about noxious weeds, saying that our front yard was a weedy mess. And we had to take the city folks through to say, there's very few weeds out here. These were all intentional. So this isn't how most people garden, but it's how we do it. A lot of people garden like this, minimalistic, couple of globe arborvitae. Here's a case where the residence is literally floating in this landscape. There's nothing. Now, I'm not saying that these people feel there's an absence of interest. Maybe this is fine for them. They don't mind string trimming along the house and getting the mower out and doing a little shearing on those arborvitae every year. But there's so much more potential that can be realized with the house style, the setting, the amount of space. Even little nuances like that gray brick becomes a foil for the certain color of plants. So maximizing the potential of our landscapes becomes important. And here's a case where I call these rocket ship yews, probably 60, 70-year-old yews that very nicely formed and shaped in scale with the home. This is on our daily dog walk, incidentally, and real nice people. I'm not criticizing this landscape. I'm just saying this is a very common Midwest approach, plunking some evergreens on the corners of the house and along the foundation and calling it good. There's a lot we can do differently around our foundations. And our landscapes don't consist simply of foundation plants and a couple trees. There's other things we're doing. Here's the minimalistic approach at a local community college. So my criticism here is a lot of that red granite mulch, which ultimately will host weeds very shortly. If you look closely, there's an expensive irrigation system there to water these cranberry cotoneasters, which may or may not have filled the space by now. And if you know the plant, it's notorious for trapping leaves and litter and other things. So I look at this western exposure and think there's so much more that could have been done here. And maybe there was a budget issue where they said, "I give me 3 cotoneasters for $20 a piece, and we'll call it good." But what a lost opportunity. And so as we look at residences, our intention is beautification, but also I alluded to scale, which we'll circle back on. The idea that yes, our landscapes, our plants are growing and filling up more space, but what they do is provide a visual anchor for our residences, our structures, and in tandem they create the scene. And again, some of that happens with age as we plant. This is a brand new landscape that has to kind of age into itself. But we do want those areas of respite. When I mention the word function, it's not about what. Let me back up and say we all consider, I need a tree here. I want a little more screening from the neighbors, or I need to redo the front shrubs in front of the bay windows. Those are all valid concerns, but you need to be looking at your square footage of your landscape, considering the 3 dimensions as I alluded to earlier, but saying, this is a great spot to have a patio, and a patio the size that will accommodate X amount of chairs, for entertaining. Maybe I need an elevated deck, or I want a path or a fence. So that hardscaping, as we call it, lends itself to serving function in the landscape. And that proverbial icing on the cake, that's where the plantings start coming in. I think all too often we tend to overplant initially in newer landscapes and then retroactively decide, shoot, I wish I had done X, Y, and Z. And again, we're always making changes. So your initial considerations are things like, again, the function. What is your landscape being used for? Is there a vegetable garden, a dog run, an area for entertaining? My little backyard has a small deck and a quite large flagstone patio for entertaining with a little kind of pavilion. And that's a functional space, but we beautified it with containers and other plantings. Consider the structure. What does it look like? Where are the windows? What color is it? And when I've done landscape designs, when I go to a client who has a blue house, I always say, "Are you going to stick with the blue siding?" They get a little nervous and a little, it's a little awkward because they're like, "Why? What's the problem?" I say, if you're sticking with the blue, which I love, I'm going to lean into golden foliage plants, or I'm using the color of your home as a foil for the plants. If you were to tell me I'm going to go with gray or maroon or black or white, that changes my palette. So back to the second point here, your structure and its location, its orientation, again, window locations, including window wells, your primary views, what's happening. This leads itself into the existing setting. What do you have for sidewalks, driveway? What's happening? Do you have low spots? Do you have existing trees or areas where you can't grow much? So evaluating your existing setting is important because we tend to force plants into situations that we're not even yet familiar with, and we're hoping they'll do well, but you should have a good feel for what you have. Understanding the maintenance that you'll create for yourself. And I've had countless people say, "I'm sick of mowing. I'm going to tear up this area and make a flower bed." And I'll say, that flower bed's going to take a lot more time to maintain than the turf. And I'm not a huge turf fan, by the way, but I say that 15 minutes of mowing, you now have a week, you have 2 hours of weeding and watering of this bed. So you have to understand the implications. We all have budgets, and plants are not becoming less expensive. Everything's going up, everything. But again, we have budgets. In the history of gardening, there's never been a better time to find a wider array of plants available to you. So do patronize your local garden centers and nurseries. That's the first very important thing to do. But solicit information, attend things like this, talk with local professionals, go to those local garden centers, get ideas. Don't come out of a color-starved winter. Go to your garden centers in April. Everyone's throwing elbows, accumulating plants, but have a kind of a feel, have a plan of attack before you end up with a van full of plants and no idea where they're going. We've all done it, myself included. So some ideas on landscape functions, are you accommodating various uses? We've talked about entertaining, active play for the kids or the grandchildren. How do you flow through the landscape? Are there paths, gates? How do people move through the landscape? Are you screening or framing views? And here's a great example on the left. A lot of folks, when they ask me to do a landscape design, will say, give me something good for curb appeal. And that's valid, but the concern is, or the consideration is, I want it to look good for people on the sidewalk or driving by. While that's valid, you need to consider what you're looking out upon, because there might be views that you want to augment, you want to screen. And so when I do landscape designs for people, I ask to go in the home and I take photos out the majority of their windows just to remember what they're looking out upon. And that helps me position plants for various purposes. Access points, similar to flow, how do you get in and out of the landscape? Energy conservation we'll address later, but that's simply the positioning of plants, particularly trees, can actually conserve energy through winter wind screening, like a windbreak, and also in those hotter summer months, the idea of well-positioned shade can lessen our air conditioning needs. And that could be an entire talk in and of itself, but when you're wondering where to plant a tree, there are some better spots to help save some money in terms of energy conservation. Are you growing plants for food? Do you have a garden? Are you into wildlife? We're not planting for deer. We don't want those squirrels to dig up our bulbs, but are we interested, in pollinators, attracting birds? Do we currently have a winter landscape that's attractive for birds right now, for shelter, for food, etc.? Beauty, of course, that's really implied with this entire topic. We want it to look nice. The outdoor room, the idea that when we do our dog walks in early evening in the summer, I'm shocked by how few people are outside in the blue glow of television. And people, to each their own. But I remember growing up in the 70s and everyone was out, and we all harken back to those days where we think things were better. But something like this is inviting to bring you out into the space. And by the way, this faces west. So the benefit to the arbor is some additional shading on that patio as the sun is past its zenith and starting to set. So who wouldn't want to? I'd rather eat dinner out here. Just step right out those sliding doors. So this isn't unique to a landscape. It's not inexpensive, but it certainly is a nice addition to extend the house out into the garden and include the garden closer to the house. So consider those little areas of respite, those usage areas. This is Old Brick Botanical Gardens in Madison, Wisconsin. You should all visit. One of my favorite little nooks with these Adirondack chairs, set off the path so people can still get by, but nice little semi-private area, lots of lush greenery, lots of things happening, very densely planted. A lot of folks are into the outdoor kitchens and grills and fireplaces. That's all valid. There's a lot of professionals that can help install those properly. Just make sure you're going to use them. That's important. I've seen way too many of these sorts of fancy contraptions, and they're not used. I just did a design in Milwaukee where they installed an exterior pizza oven and all sorts of fancy stuff, and it was quite amazing to me actually how much it cost. But again, to each their own. There's a little fire pit area in the distance in this paved area. Notice the picnic table, the little fire pit, the chimnea, the little fireplace in the distance. So I'm just showing you examples of usage areas. And that's a bedroom, by the way, the wide windows there. And that stream goes right by the bedroom windows, trickles in front of this patio. Those homeowners retired are always in those two chairs for their afternoon glass of wine. And that auditory component of the trickling stream, just amazing. Water features have their own inherent maintenance. They're not inexpensive or easy to maintain, but when well installed and well maintained, they're absolutely wonderful. Back to some ideas, layouts and themes. I'm not here to tell you that a formal versus informal, and I'll show you examples of what that means, is better or worse than the other. But maybe you have a specific garden theme of interest. I've designed 2 Japanese style backyards, landscapes. I've designed rock gardens, crevice gardens. There was an intention by the client for a specific garden theme. And maybe you have an idea of the type of garden you want. English cottage style versus a formal arrangement, or maybe a different function. And I love showing this image because it's from a landscape book in the 1950s, and it's very relevant. Notice there's no plants labeled, but what you're seeing is a very formal, rectilinear, very linear arrangement. So it's the same house, the same property, but notice the 90-degree versus 45-degree slant here, where the usage areas, the driveway, the terrace, the lawns are indicated. All the hatch marks are like future plantings. So this is just to say, you know, you don't necessarily go out and translate this specifically to your landscape, but with these straight lines, it is makes a very formal arrangement. And my parents live in Huntley, Illinois, and they have a very linear thinking. My dad in particular, so everything's very in straight rows, and that's how they landscape and garden. And so a very formal arrangement. Same house on the same property with more curves. And so it's actually the same usage areas, the same dedicated square feet, but in a more curvilinear fashion. The difference, the eye, when it enters a formal landscape, think about those fancy European gardens. Your eye can very quickly, like Versailles, your eye can very quickly take in the dimensions and all the formal elements. And it's grandiose. It's impressive. There's nothing wrong with the fact that you can encompass it all, but the more informal landscapes leave a little bit of mystery. The eye takes a little bit longer to work through the curves and such. So again, it's really up to you, and there's no reason to do one or the other. You can mix and match. Again, you're landscaping for yourself. But some brief examples. Here's a little setup of mirror image beds. This is actually at the Clem Arboretum in Rockford, Illinois, a little formal setting here. And anybody could do something like this with a nice bench. This is in Waukesha, Wisconsin. Interesting story, repurposed brick from old streets in Milwaukee. This person, very crafty fella, was driving by and they were tearing up a street, and he arranged through bribery and coercion to get about 5,000 of these bricks they were just going to pitch, these old street bricks. And he's created this sort of Williamsburg sort of setup. The red and white are wax begonias, but you notice very formal in its arrangement. Ironically, his 1 acre landscape includes about 7 different garden styles. But look at the boxwood hedges in this very formal setup. So not heavy on plant diversity, but very beautiful. I bet with some snow on it, it's quite sharp. Little angel in the center. At Rotary Gardens in Janesville, Wisconsin, we had a French formal garden and an Italian formal garden. Notice these 8 parterres with boxwood are mirror image plantings, and we've put these obelisks as strong verticals in the center. And Rotary Gardens just came out of their big light show, and these obelisks would have still been there with lights on them for the light show, as would the boxwoods. But those are all annuals, by the way. The color scheme changes every year, as does the color of the obelisks. But I just want to show here's a formal setup, and very few of us will do this in the backyard because it's expensive. There's a lot of water, a lot of plant expense, but in the public garden setting, quite nice. A garden in the Netherlands, very narrow. Notice the separation of space. There's some changes in materials, a little bit of a grade change. Your destination is that little kind of leisure shed, that little hangout in the distance. So notice the width of this landscape is like 18 feet wide, and it's like 50-foot deep. But look at I love the separation of space, and still enough plantings to soften it up, lend a little bit of privacy. And who wouldn't want to traverse the length of that? At Chanticleer Garden in Wayne, Pennsylvania, this is their ruins garden, very informal. Not only in its setup, you see a curved steps to the right, but lots of informal plantings. All that orange you see is butterfly weed. So this is an image in midsummer. The grass is Mexican feather grass, which is an annual for us, perennial for them in the Philadelphia area. But we're still on examples of formal versus informal. At Rotary Gardens, I literally did the old lay a hose out and spray painted a line to create, this became a hosta garden. And the reason I did that was to visually, I wanted to like the curve, but we also, before I sprayed the grass and killed off the right side, we took our riding mowers out there to make sure we could handle those curves. So maintenance was a consideration in terms of the tightness of the curves, because we didn't want to have to do a lot of string trimming. And this is one of my clients. We played with this hose many times over. Unfortunately, it was very rigid hose, so it didn't help with the curves. But a lot of that area to the right of the hose became garden underneath those trees. So, really envision it. And this is, again, before you start placing plants, you're getting those curves you like. And again, these are some informal settings. And here's a late summer, early fall shot of a beautiful garden in Janesville, and love the ornamental grasses. We're looking over some zinnias here. There's a beautiful fireworks goldenrod right dilly dab in the center. Notice the yellow of the goldenrod is echoed with there's a golden sumac called tiger eyes in the distance there. I feel the only thing lacking here are maybe some evergreens for a little more privacy from the backside neighbors. But notice this peninsula that juts out from the left side. It makes you wonder what's kind of in that back left corner. So again, your eye is still, as I babble on here, is traversing this and looking at all these plants. So decide how much turf you really want. And remember my earlier comment, turf is great for active use for the kids, for when you need to set up that temporary tent, your bocce ball, jarts, whatever. Well, no one does jarts anymore. I've dated myself there, but um, at home, we got rid of most of our turf and have returned some of it for the grandson. But broad expanses of turf I've maintained for 30 years, including the healing garden where I currently work, because they're activity spaces and for special events. But you may decide that you want to do something different, so consider, turf patterns are easy to maintain, but do they support the function of the garden? Becomes important. So perspective, these are again features of the landscape to consider. Depth, visual depth adds spaciousness. So think about that garden I just showed with a little peninsula jutting out. That implied some depth. That helped visually. It made you think the garden space was a little bigger. It was a little mysterious. The idea that in terms of perspective, we don't want to see the entire landscape at once. So if we can provide a little mystery, that becomes important. And that might be through bed design or plant placement. There's a lot of other things we can do. Circular gardens or elements like this little patio with repurposed bricks, your eye is drawn right to the center to that planting. And this is just a teeny little spot in a very small yard. But this is where this homeowner congregates. This is where she's always out for tea and for entertaining. So this inward focus distracts from outer boundaries, which includes a very active street and some boisterous neighbors. So she's got her own little secluded area here. So she's looking inward to the space. And so we do create little spaces. And notice the combination of hardscaping, stacked land and stone wall on the right with a cap, and on the left, some sheared yews, creating a little island in an area that has peripheral screening and such. But that's a nice little spot. I like that. Green Bay Botanic Garden, wonderful public garden, by the way. Obviously, this is very formal, and we're not tearing out our entire backyards to do this. We can see this at public gardens, but you can see, again, a lot of mirror imaging in very rigid formality with the bench placement, path width, everything. And this is beautiful to look at. There's no doubt about it. But to my earlier comment, your eye is already, you're appreciating the color and the detail, but your eye already has defined the space. And that's important with formal gardens. And that hardscaping, again, a nice circular patio here, drawing your eye to the center. We'll talk about hardscaping materials a little bit later on, and I'll jump to the chase and say, if you're DIY, doing it yourself, make sure you know what you're doing in terms of proper installation for longevity. Because there's a lot of quick ways of doing things like brick patios that you regret not doing it the right way. You get what you pay for. So if you're getting professional help, get folks that know what they're doing, because being built to last in the long run is worth the expense. But I love the use of repurposed bricks. Look closely, by the way. The gaps in the bricks in that inner circle have stones between them too, river stones. And this was interesting. There's a street and a parking lot behind this. So these folks, they actually dug down 2 feet. So what's interesting, if you look along that fence, that's cannas. And by the mid to late summer, that's an entire hedge of cannas. So they're blocking some of the noise, but they're blocking all the vision of the parking and cars going by. So they've sunken themselves in a little bit for this fire pit, so they do get the privacy. And this is all they had to work with. I thought this was ingenious, doing this. And so we kind of work with the site. That goes back to assessing what you have. This is a different perspective from that raised wall and yew hedge that you saw earlier. And it's those areas of where we like to whether gather or quiet contemplation, relax, a reflecting pond in this case. And to my earlier comment about water features, it's important to just know that even something like that has some implied maintenance. At this point in time, it would have been drained and cleaned, and if there's fish involved, there's a lot of things that go with it. And my time at Rotary Gardens in Janesville, we had 15 water features of various scales, and it was a lot of work. But when they ran well, it was absolutely worth it. So we're circling back to some of these things to consider, garden themes. This is a little garden in Janesville where they took a kind of a Japanese garden theme. If you look closely, there's a little Japanese lantern. The brick is not Asian and it's as a derivative, from a garden, but what it is repurposed brick. So this is an entire hodgepodge garden where they made these little themes, and they're very crafty gardeners and very thrifty. And I appreciate what they did with their little landscape here. If you look in the middle back of this image, this is the same garden that had that colonial Williamsburg with the repurposed brick. Do you remember the red and white wax begonias? That's what's in the distance. He created a Japanese style fern and moss garden. And this rake gravel sea represents an ocean. Those are waves punctuated by islands, which are the rocks. And so he gets out there and rakes it a couple times every week, cleans off the litter and debris. And I think I have some other images of his garden, which is quite exceptional. But he's decided to do many themes. And I alluded to the fact that he has 7 themes in his property. Nice water feature here, Asian themed water feature. This was in Buffalo, New York. By the way, if they have the biggest garden walk in the world, I think, definitely domestically. It's hundreds of houses, and I was fortunate to visit quite a few of them on a trip many years ago. But I thought this was quite beautiful and nice privacy. Again, you have to decide how that garden will work for you. What I appreciate about this landscape is there's some topography, there's a grade change. And in lieu of just a slope of mown turf and some erosion, this stacked rock has created tiers or terraces. But notice the punctuation of conifers, the softening of some of the edges, that bright yellow yucca right in the foreground, that very succulent looking plant. And if you look closely, the rocks that come around that yucca, it's a dry stream as we view it, but actually surplus water from the property will actually come down this. It'll become an active stream to vacate surplus water. So it has a function as well. There's a liner under that. So I thought this was a great approach to what originally 20 years ago was just a slope down to a path. There's the moss garden for, pardon me a second. Sorry, one of my cats is going bonkers over here. Colonial Williamsburg, the Japanese style, this is the moss garden. And so mosses have a 400 million year history. Truly amazing. And Dale Sievert's the fellow's name. And what he's done is taken little pieces of moss and created this amazing garden. And this is just a very small portion of it. So this is just amazing to me, but he's replicated the islands, the rocks punctuating it. At the Chicago Botanic Garden, here's their English garden. So there are some formal elements here, but while the garden setting is quite formal with walls and statuary and other elements, the plantings are quite informal, drifts and masses, a lot of white and yellow in this theme. Chicago Botanic is a top-notch garden as well, which most of you know, and head over to Glencoe, see what they're doing. It's fabulous. And I love this image. This is one of the, I'm looking at the sign here, trying to remember who this was. This is Neenah, Wisconsin. This gentleman sent me this image, and look at the assortment of containers. So here's a spot where on his property off his driveway where someone might just have turf or they might park an extra car. He's made it a collection of pots. And notice the repurposing, the blue and orange are PVC pipes where he's secured containers on top. So he has these colorful pillars. I think that's just fabulous, to be honest. I think that's awesome. So again, garden for yourselves, not the neighbors. And I have a feeling those neighbors in the Chartreuse house there probably don't mind the greenery. So back to considering the structure itself. Of course, this is a little fairy house, but here's an example. The architecture of the house may lend itself to a certain design style. And this is the perfect example. Long horizontal lines with this Frank Lloyd Wright style. So notice the long horizontal lines are augmented or accentuated with the rockwork. Same deal with terraces, little plantable areas. They've even trained some of the plant material to be quite horizontal. There's a crabapple and I think a compact plum there offering interest, but my eye travels. I think this is perfect scale. This is a perfect approach to this home. When you think about foundation plants, a lot of people consider, what am I going to plant in that 3 to 5 foot window, along my house, that little area? And a lot of us do that, and you can do it successfully. But what's happened here is the foundation plants have extended almost 30 feet from the house. So this long visual to the home as you come up the driveway, you have this nice balance. And on the far left, in front of the chimney, a beautiful weeping purple fountains beech, that maroon weeping tree, which will continue to slowly gain height, but will be just remarkable and plays off the tan real well as also. So this was a design. I did the design 20 years ago. I visited a couple years later. Hopefully this stuff is filled in, but I was totally considering the gray stucco in terms of placement of plant materials. And if you look to the left in front of the window, there's some maroon leaf shrubs. I love maroon against gray. We have some gold in there. So our selection and placement of the plant material took into account not only the house facade, but we certainly didn't want to block windows or create an issue where there'd be very quick removals. By the way, as a side note, when you saw my earlier sketches with the little fancy symbols using a circle template on vellum, we were taught when we're doing the sizes of the plant material, when we're doing those little circles and such, to consider 7 to 12 years maturity. Like, what are those plants going to look like, in a decade or so? But plants never truly stop growing, and that's why it's not hard to see overgrown landscapes. So even this one, there's implied maintenance down the road, whether that's removals or, hey, I'm going to have to trim that. So professional landscape installation, there's a fine balance between creating a full look in a reasonable amount of time and both underplanting and overplanting. So do realize as a fluid situation, there's just a lot of factors involved. But if you look on that broad expanse to the right, there's kind of a contorted thing right in the center. And that's a weeping white spruce, which my guess has gotten to the gutter by now and has a very interesting silhouette 365 days of the year. And its intention was to bring the scale of that blank facade down. I did a landscape for this historic home in Janesville. This is, oh my gosh, 120 years old, this amazing house. And we used period landscaping, period plants. I don't have an after shot, but the consideration here was not to do anything to take away from the architecture of the home. But as you see it here, it's a floater. There's not much going on in front of it. So things had been removed. It had been overgrown and uncared for. So this was an entire renovation by a young family. And we did some fun things to augment the situation. But your eye is drawn to the details of that home, but the landscape can certainly supplement that. And so you start to consider things like, this was a client a couple of years ago where they had this ancient retaining wall and they were talking about removing it and doing something different. And I said, that rock has been there probably 80, 90 years. There's not too many issues of failing. And so I convinced them to do just a little restacking, adding some rocks and just doing a little repair work in lieu of an entire redo. But in this case, there was a consideration, the assessment on site that this topography had to be dealt with. And it was dealt with 80 years ago, but you have to consider, again, evaluating if those systems are still functional. All the roof, most of the roof water actually drains over or through this wall. So that's something to keep in mind. But back to considering the structure. I love this brick house. We redid the plantings in their entirety in front. That band of hydrangeas, as beautiful as they are, it's very monochromatic and it's kind of just a simple planting. So we did some other things to augment the house, keeping in mind in the afternoon, notice the shade cast by the home. And when we consider sun and shade for plant materials, shade, of course, can be cast by trees, overhead canopies. Shade also cast by structures and such is a consideration. But consider the view. I won't keep bringing this up, but essentially, this is a great image to reiterate what I said earlier, and that's, yes, you can consider the view to this house, but you should consider when you're in that room looking out those windows, what's your view? And are you maintaining that view with what you've decided to plant in front? And so we did some work to renovate this, to keep those are almost to floor to ceiling windows. So we wanted to maintain as much glass as possible, but yet soften the facade a little bit. And considering what you like to look out on. And so this was at a client's house. Notice, and by the way, if you do birdseed, and I do, sunflower hulls negate plant growth. It's very hard to grow anything under an active bird feeder, which many of you are probably aware of. So they gave up on it. And and put in some brick there to just define that circle. But what's neat is that's their primary living room. So they can, here's a winter shot. They can look right out on the feeders. And a lot of us do this. This makes sense. But in the summer months, there's a lot of plantings along that far fence to offer some privacy from the other home. Actually, they were a client as well. So they actually have some shared plants along that border. But sometimes you have a blank expanse. What are you going to do with this? There's just so much potential. And obviously they have kids. So we have a sandbox here. We have a little slide. Their interest in my involvement simply was where to place trees. And that's where I started talking about, and this is west facing also. So I said, we really need to get a tree about 10 to 15 feet off that patio. And they said, well, isn't that going to be too close? And I said, well, if we pick the right tree, it'll be a shorter duration of time before you get some nice afternoon shade on that patio. Because on July 17th, when it's 95 degrees out, nobody's going out on that patio. It's just not going to happen. So if you want to actively use it, we need to start doing those things. Or it could be an awning or something else, but you really evaluate the nuances of the site. And blank slates can be as challenging as mature landscapes. There's just a lot of considerations on what you want to do and how you'll maintain it. So I won't wax poetic about every image here, but again, it's important to consider how these landscapes grow. And this is a tidy landscape. My criticism is that on the corner there, that golden sumac wants to be 12 to 15 feet tall. So they're going to be pruning it away from the home. So what you're seeing here is that courtesy 3-foot wide planted border. If you look to the far right between those two windows, that's an upright arborvitae. Well, that won't stop growing. That wants to be 40 feet tall and 10 to 15 feet wide. And it certainly can be sheared. The sumac can be pruned. But are these people going to want to do that? So again, 3 feet is not wide enough, folks, by the way. You really need to do more in terms of the foundation. And as tidy as it looks in year 1, it's year 4 and 5 where you start wondering what to change. And borrowed scenery, this is at Chanticleer, the garden I showed earlier, an open veranda here, looking at all sorts of neat stuff. So you're seeing in the foreground houseplants with the overhead roof here, but in this case, trees in the distance, other plants in the foreground, still kind of a view here, but also privacy. There's a path right in front of these tropical plants. So there's a little bit of privacy. It's not a total opening. And I love this view through the center line of these bay windows. If you look closely past that chimenea, that golden conifer is a Skylands Oriental spruce. This was 15 years ago. And so that thing's about 20 feet tall now. And so what we have in the center line of this window, 365 days a year, is a very symmetrical golden conifer. And there's a backdrop of arborvitae and some other plants, but very well positioned to be that bright spot throughout the year. And it's a foil for other plants during the growing season. She has blue delphiniums up against the gold. And when I talked about using the facade of a color facade as a backdrop, you're doing that with your plant material too. You're combining plants that make each other look better. And look at this interesting approach to a basement window at ground level. Water feature to look out upon. I worry, I play devil's advocate with everything. And I think, boy, if that pond started to leak, would there be some issues in that basement? Having said that, I would love to be inside, have a basement bedroom and look out those windows every morning at frogs and other things. That's kind of neat. And one thing I've done for years is, here's a long facade of a house, wide open porch. One thing you can do is literally take a photo like this, get some tracing paper over it. I'll back up and do this. I mean, very easy. And start scribbling in some things. And I haven't even labeled the plants. I'm not even sure what those little blobs will be, but I put some grasses and some shrubs. I'll back up and say, the people entertain out in this overhang patio system. So I didn't want to block a lot of the view, but in essence, I wanted to just see what would work for scale. And notice the retaining wall. I'll back up and say, there's no retaining wall. Look how that's kind of rubble slope from left to right, nothing going on there, but we would need to install retaining walls to level it. And the side of the home, wrapping around the side, same deal. And this is just conceptual. You don't start getting a shovel out and saying, I'm building a retaining wall. You sketch it out and you see what works. And notice the consideration of the windows. So some principles of design. So again, landscape design basics. Repetition, the idea of repeating elements. I'll show you examples of all of this. Variety, mixing it up, lots of different things. Balance, that comes with time with the landscape. And the best way to describe that will be to show you some examples. Emphasis and accent, that's personalizing the landscape, doing some fun things. And that might include plants, it might include other things, statuary, the bird bath, the gazing ball, pink flamingo, whatever you might want to do for accent. The scale relates to balance, and I'll show you examples of landscapes out of scale. In sequence refers to the fact that as landscape as a series of functional spaces should have a sequence or flow, both a physical flow and a visual flow. So you can crack open a book on landscape design and these same terms will come out at you. And it's not as important to consider this as a checklist as just some elements to consider. The image on the left is a terrace I designed for literally a 45-degree slope of garbage. There was nothing there. And at great expense, this terrace system was put in, and there were little areas for benches and plantings down to this patio. And ultimately, a non-usable space became quite usable. But some of these elements are in there, repetition of certain grasses, conifers. There's a lot of things that we'll reiterate as we go through these images. But whether you're using similar plants or colors or shapes, they help unify a composition. Great example on the right, this shaded border. Look at the repetition of certainly gold, but look at that golden Hakoni grass. Look at the little tufts of gold grass, kind of equidistant along the path, softening the path, but offering this repetitive blip of interest. And this continues off camera. This just keeps going. So there's been this repetition of that fine textured gold. Vertical elements can help achieve repetition. And remember, we don't garden in the 2 dimensions like the little plans I sketch. We have 3-dimensional elements. So vertical elements, remember the green obelisks in those boxwood parterres? Those vertical elements were repetitive. They had repetition. They offered scale. And many of our upright conifers and plants will also do the same thing. So unexciting landscape of junipers that have been sheared into weird shapes. There's windows, by the way, in each of those sort of indentations, but I had to stop. I was going 50 miles an hour and I saw this and I had to stop and get a photo. And, they're paying someone to maintain this and mow and lost potential. Absolutely. Low maintenance, pretty much. Junipers are pretty low maintenance, but in this case, here's repetition, but not really effective in terms of diversity. Love this repetition of late in fall. Notice the orange mums in these containers at Olbrich. And this arbor, of course, has equidistant pillars, and we have some overhead interests, some grasses going on. But who wouldn't start on this path and say, I wonder what's happening off to the right there. Your eye and your feet are led in a direction. And there's that movement through the landscape. One of the borders at Rotary Gardens, these are all seasonal plants, but look at the repetition of that big dark grass called elephant grass. So we certainly have a color scheme here. It was our Gothic year, lots of reds and maroons, but the repetition of that massive purple grass, a type of pennisetum called vertigo, offered the repetition along an entire 140-foot long border. So about 3 times the length of what you're viewing here. And so a lot of diversity here, a lot of richness, a lot of money and expense and watering and fertilizing. So the neat thing about these spaces is we could transition them every year, different colors. But our design principles of repetition held firm. And here's an old shot of Chanticleer. This area doesn't exist anymore, but in essence, the repetitive element here is simply the gold. And it's different types of plants, but it's been peppered through here. And when you have a lot of gold, you do need to put in some blue. When you have a lot of blue, you throw in some gold. Look at the repetition of silver and black with the silver cardoons, the black elephant ears. Again, these are all seasonal plants, not winter hardy, but a little border at a local garden as well. And definitely thematic. But if this were a black and white image, you'd still have the repetition of texture. And I love it for its subtropical appearance. And this was a fun garden. At Rotary, we did a yellow and blue theme, and I've already alluded to yellow and blue working well together. What you're seeing there, those are culvert pipes, galvanized steel that have been painted, jammed in the ground. A garbage can full of soil has been secured in the top. They're not full of soil. There's just kind of a garbage can in there. The grass is called blue lime grass, and I'll just say never plant it in your landscape open grown because it's horrendous in terms of spread. In this case, we knew it would be contained in the container and be nice and blue and fluffy. But back to this border is only 6 foot deep. So this long border on our terrace garden, we wanted to add scale and repetition. So we used non-living element, the culvert pipe, and painted it. And we have the repetition of color and form. and certainly the vertical elements. Grass is repeated along a border, more of that Hakone grass. Variety, mixing it up. And I'm showing you a lot of annuals here, but annuals, we all like different sorts of plants, but when I say a seasonal or an annual, things like impatiens and everything in here is not winter hardy in this image. But the concept here is variety, mixing it up. So I've said repeat elements. You might have the same plant repeated, but you do want to have a diverse landscape. You don't want to have 12 different plants out there. You really want to mix it up. So variety can refer to the combination of plants and elements. Quality is more important than quantity. And that goes back to knowing your site and putting in appropriate plants. So things like this is a golden sumac, a rose, a smoke bush. The names of the plants aren't as important as saying we've got some flower power here, but also some very interesting foliage as well. Northwind Perennial Farm in Lake Geneva. This is their no maintenance garden. And I mean KNOW, meaning know your maintenance. These are all low maintenance plants, by the way, but this summer scheme, notice the repetition of the ornamental onions, the allium. That's all those hovering light pink spheres. This is a great pollinator garden, lots of things going on. But again, no maintenance, knowing what you're doing. And I'm looking at my watch. I'm going to speed up a little here, folks, because I don't want to keep you all night long. But again, the simple concept with all my myriad examples here is mixing up a wide range of plant material. And in this case, conifers, woody plants. It doesn't have to be shrubs along the foundation, 2 trees, a little perennial border. You can do compositional landscaping where you're including just about everything. You don't have to relegate certain types of plants to certain areas. Sometimes that's called for, but I like this deep planting with all sorts of things, including a pretty good sized juniper ground cover as the blue, and all that gold in the foreground is a creeping sedum, where ground covers have been left to fill some large spaces. Visual balance, the idea, I alluded to the fact that it sometimes comes with time. It doesn't mean that you have to remember the image of the floating house with just 2 globe arborvitae in the front. That's balance. That was beautifully balanced, but it's lacking everything else. Balance considers the fulcrum effect, the idea that when you're looking at a landscape or out upon it, it just looks like it fits. And I'm not verbalizing it real well, but it does come in time with as landscapes age. And back to that 1950s landscape book, I love some of the terms they used here. Notice restless and squeezed. And so they're showing examples. Overpowered. I wouldn't mind an overpowered situation. That's kind of how I live. Notice the unbalance in the mid left. So we're kind of lacking plant material on a side there. But, here's a balanced home, not overly exciting. That stuff's looking pretty raggedy, but it's in scale and it has balance. Perfectly sheared yews. So a monoculture of yews. And I would never criticize this landscape because I appreciate this is how they landscape for themselves. There's nothing wrong with that. The question does come up, if this was a client said, is there something else I could do? I would say, yeah, let's sit down and we'll talk. Foundation plants should be anchoring the house. I've used that term often. It's hard to tell what the image on the right is, but that's 2 overgrown yews in front of a house that have left like a 2-foot gap for the mail carrier to shove through. I'd be concerned, I hate to play the devil's advocate, but coming home at night, who knows, that's a little hiding spot there too. So personal safety comes into the equation. But foundation plants should do all sorts of great things, like providing interest and scale, and can provide color and augment the home. You shouldn't feel limited. So I'm not slamming yews here, but this massive flying saucer, and my play on words, that's 120 square feet. So maybe something else could be done there. So here's some foundation types from that same book. So quite interesting. Look at spotty, lower right, incomplete. I would agree. Disturbing. I don't know. I love this book, by the way. My brother's landscape, he's in Medina. Notice his foundation comes way out from the home. Lots of color, lots of interest. The emphasis and accent can be non-living elements. In this case, it could be an interesting plant or the bird bath, or in this case, those blue benches. It invites you in there. It's hard to even see a path, but it's like, yeah, I can get back in there. I got a little spot I can sit. The accents in this image, look at the variegated iris punctuating the sedum in the foreground, and then there's a maroon sedum punctuating that ground cover juniper. Those are cool accents. Accents can be seasonal. This um, full moon maple on the left is green the entire growing season and then becomes a glowing accent in the fall. So its contribution, primary contribution, is this fall color. This is in the fern and moss garden at Rotary Gardens. Tacking some old birdhouses on the side of the barn. Remember, open facades do scream for some scale, and whether that's plants in front of them or something secured, could be vines, could be a trellis, could be birdhouses. It could be an old rusty scooter on the side of the garage with a container on it. Notice the repurposed window in the upper right. There's no plantable space in front of this garage, so they decided they're going to create some interest and plantable space. And a neat little recirculating fountain here. This old wine glass, water's being pumped back up and through it. So a little auditory component there. So focal points, you've maybe heard the term. They can lead the eye in the landscape. I like to position focal points, not necessarily these blue bottle trees, which I personally think are pretty cool. But the center line of windows, do you remember that Skylands Oriental spruce, that golden spruce right down the middle? That was a focal point. So they can create suspense. They can encourage travel. Like I'm heading that way. So formal gardens have lots of focal points that lead you through the space. They can be small or large. It can be living or non-living, like the wine bottles. Longwood Gardens out east. Look at this cupola here. Mirror image. Caryopteris is the blue and the white are Rosa Sharon, but who wouldn't want to head towards that? You're guided right to that focal point. This is back at Northwind Perennial Farm. Lots of interest. The focal point is that dry stacked boulder pyramid. Super neat. I've seen a couple of those now. Really sharp. They didn't appreciate when I pulled the bottom rock out. That wasn't smart. No, I'm just kidding. But dry stacked, that's amazing. But here's a focal point. Say you're on this path, very formal setting. You see this water feature. What happens when you get to that feature? You can sit on those benches, or what's revealed, your destinational guidance, it brings you there. What's revealed are paths to the left and right, which also subsequently have other focal points. So you're being led through a space. So, water features can guide the eye. I joke about gazing balls and pink flamingos, but whatever trips your trigger, my mom's had a gazing ball forever. And, well positioned it as a focal point. Yes, they attract the eye. The focal point here behind this bench is that tricolor beach, that pink maroon variegated beach. And that focal point will slowly gain size, but it's right on the center line of that bench. And what a great spot to reach and sit. The idea of scale, we've talked a little bit about balance, but scale again can be overgrown. Here's some views. Talk about privacy. That sitting out on that deck here, total privacy. Those still can be cut back, sheared, or removed. But here's a case where they just were left to their own devices, as were these arborvitae. So here's a landscape out of scale. Here's a house engulfed. The storyline was, Mom and Dad, I have these 12 little arborvitae. Back in 1963, National Arbor Day Foundation or something, I've got 12 little arborvitaes. Well, let's put them around the yard. And this is what they've done. And so adding privacy, sure. But way too close to the house, providing unwelcome winter shade. The sun's not getting to the roof very well or the windows to help warm the home. By the way, those are all gone now, I'm happy to say, but it drove me nuts seeing this landscape. And that's not inexpensive to get those out there, but there was a point in time, probably 15 years ago, where someone could have said, either we're going to shear these or take them out. But scale, these are just little meatball spireas, similar to that earlier image with the cotoneasters in that red granite. Here's a bunch of spirea. Budget, I'm sure, was a factor for the local pool, but look at the lost opportunity with that wall as a backdrop for something. And these will gain size. They'll get 3 to 4 feet tall and wide, but still not overly exciting. Destinational guidance in terms of landscape design. Do you remember that old brick image with the mums? The idea that that path is leading you somewhere. Look at this golden black locust. Lower branches have been left. There's some grasses on the left, but you can't see what's around to the right. So you're being guided to some other destination. Pretty straight shot here, but these pavers help elevate the feet above mud or wet mulch, but a straight line to the back door. What's behind this camera is an open, collective open space that many homes share. So it's a straight shot to the communal gathering spot. I won't spend a lot of time with the history of what these images you're seeing, but where is this headed? Then I get critical and say I wouldn't want to be wearing heels walking on this, carrying a glass of wine to a wedding or something. That's an ankle turner. But I'd like to know what's at the end of the path, as I would here or here. Nice cut bluestone. Heels would be better on this for sure. Notice the steps. So the topography. Here's our destinational guidances up top. So topography unlocks unlimited potential for development, whether it's retaining wall steps. There's expense involved with all that, but you can really take advantage of it. Here's a case where pavers were put in the turf to guide people. It's actually at UW-Madison campus. The intent is 100% to minimize cow paths on the turf. But notice that everything is settled around them, so they become mowing hazards. Like they have to weed whip around these. You can't run a riding mower over these. So I'm a little critical of it, but I appreciate they're trying to guide folks a certain direction. And same thing, this is at Swarthmore College out near Philly. And the gardener told me people coming from where I took the photo or the opposite direction, the shortest distance between 2 points is across that grass. So they said, we're not going to make a solid path, but we'll make a pseudo path here with pavers. But what's going on in that the English the walled garden at Chicago Botanic? Well, go through that blue gate. So non-living features, we know decks, patios, all these things that add to our landscapes, and they help support function, whether it's entertaining or whatever it happens to be. More often than not, here's a case of some retaining walls that were installed a long time ago that need a little bit of additional work. But in lieu of a slope, and what you don't know, the history to the right, that low spot periodically floods and water has come all the way up to the top patio. So the intention here is water tolerant plants along both of those terraces, but the retaining walls have become to be compromised. So hardscaping, the nuances of installation are so important. I can't stress that enough. A lot of my consultations are evaluating landscape features that have failed, and not because of excessive age, like, they're just getting old. It's more like, I wish someone had installed this better 4 years ago. But hardscaping, look at the repurposed brick and a stacked boulder wall on the left. Maybe not great for sitting on the left, but defining space. Another sunken sitting area with a fire pit, separating this space from surrounding lawn. So again, I won't wax poetic for the sake of time, but creating these little hollow privacy areas. The fire pit, what a great space to congregate. Little bridges in an Asian style garden, a nice water feature, nice stream. So deciding where you're going to sit and enjoy the landscape or the view or your late afternoon glass of wine, those functional spaces are what we then augment with plantings. Notice the elevated trellis. This was in Buffalo, New York, but so this fellow mentioned he had the fence. If you look beyond that covered table, there's a 6-foot tall fence, and he said, I needed a little more privacy from the neighbors. So he added that additional trellising, which I don't know if that's code or not, but in essence, he created just a little more privacy. But what a lush spot around the deck. And, briefly, the fence can offer separation. We know that. We just had a new cedar fence installed in our backyard last year, not dissimilar to this. An enclosure can create privacy, but in this case, here's kind of an unexciting space that has yet to get further development. So fences take up minimal footprint as opposed to, say, a hedge or plantings with more depth. And I'm not saying one's better than the other. Fences do have also inherent maintenance and such, but you have to consider gate locations, the materials, staining, proper installation. Are you going to secure things to the fence, add things for scale, whatever it happens to be? But they can lack intimacy. And so there's different styles of fences. Notice this interesting fence in our Japanese garden at Rotary Gardens. And there's different approaches to slatted fences, those that might offer a little more air circulation. Our neighbors put a fence around their landscape that was blocked all the breeze. So it's like a stagnant place. And they have five kids. They've since moved, but the backyard was just stagnant because of a very solid fence around the entire thing. Our daily dog walk, we love saying hi to these folks. And so this fence is saying, hey, this is our space, but we have this lattice work. We don't mind the breeze. We don't mind saying hi to you as you walk by with your dogs. And I think this is a great compromise. I like that fence a lot. Or you can start softening fences with hanging baskets or repurpose windows. Do you remember the scooter? There's just lots of fun little things you can do here. Very minimal plantable space in the foreground or down low, but some fun knickknacks you can put on the fence. Or just start doing fun things with gargoyles and pedestals. Plants were struggling in this area because of the root system of all the trunks there, arborvitae, that had been limbed up. So the soil was just difficult to grow anything. So they elevated the containers. But, the idea of not so much a window box, but a fence box for softening, and the nuances of soil preparation, drainage, proper plants, watering, that all becomes important. This little fence panel with a couple implied windows for a view, I thought was kind of neat. Hedging, there's the maintenance thing, the idea that you're paying someone to do this 2 or 3 times a year, or you're getting out there with the shears yourself. I joke about this. I took a photo of this as it's a plastic hedge that's used for separation at weddings or outdoor venues. So it's on a trailer and 2 people can pop it off and set it out there. Very low maintenance, of course, but hedging has a lot of potential, and it could be a topic in and of itself. But the water feature thing, the most important thing I mentioned was proper installation and maintenance. It becomes so important. And this was a little area on the side of a house that had nothing going on. So they set a little pond in there, repurposed brick patio, and what a fun space. A lot of containers. All the impatiens around the pond are in containers. The soil, there's lots of tree roots from surrounding trees throughout this entire area. But they created, from a totally unused space, a very usable space. So consider the nuances. The auditory component is amazing. They're magnets for kids. Larger water features, there's safety concerns, as there would be with a pool or something like that, of course. But the idea of filters and fish and algae and chemicals, and I keep bringing these things up just because I've had to deal with those challenges. But when we consider paths, they can be made of so many different types of materials. We've already seen inset paths. So this is saying, yes, go this way. You can walk on the grass, but we provided you, and think about with heavy rains, you'd still be able to traverse this without getting into the gushiness. Same deal with these flagstones placed on an approach to an enclosed porch, and easy to mow right over these. Morton Arboretum, you guys aren't far from Lisle. Great place. Their children's garden, beautiful with steps and brick patterns. And again, for the sake of I still have a lot to cover, and I want to get to the questions. But deciding bricks and patterns, and I love the antique brick look. I don't mind the moss there. Here are bricks set on edge, so less surface area exposed, but kind of a tighter setup. But here's the importance of proper brick installation. Look at this. Is a lawsuit waiting to happen. It's at a public garden. I won't say which one, but I walked through this and I thought, oh my goodness, something's going to happen here. It's not even heels getting caught in here. It's just plain out tripping. So this is settled over time and needs to be totally redone. But notice this paver pattern. The circle helps define where the table and chairs will go. And these are the tumbled kind of prefab blocks, which are very suitable for patios. I prefer bricks personally, but here's some more of the concrete blocks that have been tumbled to look a little rustic, a little beat up and chipped. But there's nothing neater than a nicely laid brick patio in my mind. And notice the outdoor furniture and containers. Again, these little nooks and crannies where we decide we're going to enjoy our landscape. Flagstone with some gaps for plants. Flagstone very tightly placed. My flagstone patio out back is probably 600 square feet, and we love it. And we're growing creeping thyme and other things in the cracks. And we puzzle pieced it together. We weren't interested in that. We wanted some gaps. But here's bluestone cut into some patterns. That's pretty fun. Here's some of that tinted concrete. So this is poured and patterned. Excuse me, I keep hitting the forward. Those aren't bricks along the sides. That soldier course, as they call it, is still concrete. But they've made it look a little more rustic, and so this is literally concrete. Notice sometimes with a delineation of a new space, paving materials will change. In this case, we're walking on exposed aggregate to a bluestone separator to a brick path into a new garden, and that may not be common in our landscapes, but just know there's so many materials and even combinations of materials. A straight shot of concrete, you wouldn't even look down; you would just walk it. But the separation. The irregular separation of these blocks with the bricks makes you kind of look down and appreciate the detail. and that little landing pad there with some different patterns as well. Very modern home and modern landscape, but I love those brick squares inset amongst the bluestone and the repetition of those containers. So a word about edging. Why do we use edging? Primarily to separate turf from garden beds. And what you're seeing here is the old-fashioned vinyl edging with the tube on top. And more often than not, it does this. We hit it with a mower or weed whipper, or we didn't install it well enough. In properly installed vinyl edging, it's fairly rustic, but can be effective but needs to be functional. Edging has to be contiguous. It has to be solid where grass can't infiltrate through it or under it. And in this case, hostas on the right, or daylilies, it looks like the grass is going to work its way in. Here's steel edging defining a brick walk that has settled immensely. So the problem here is the edging is bucked up and the bricks have gone down. So this does need to be reset. Originally, that steel edging was about 3/4 of an inch above the brick. And these scalloped pieces, they sell these everywhere now, and landscapers use a lot of them because you can make different curves. Well, there's gaps. They're touching. They're abutting. In that teeny little eighth of an inch gap, grass will infiltrate. In this case, from right to left, and you're caught dealing with the infiltration. So visually, you have a separation. Hey, my garden bed's on the left. The grass knows it as well. But here's along a pathway. Notice these inset bricks. The reason for this is to mitigate any sort of erosion from the bed onto the path. So that's quite effective. There's some mud getting through there, but not a lot. And here's more blocks being set together. And I'm not a fan of separate elements creating an edge. You want a sharp separation. What you're seeing here is aluminum edging, and I'm not a spokesperson for aluminum edging, but in this case, I'll bet this is the same edge, by the way. This is what you'll see next. The intention is here's grass that's not going to get into what I have on the right. And in this case, the edging is 5 inches deep, which is suitable. 4 to 5 is the minimum you'd want to go for edging depth to keep turf from going under it. An edging placed too deep, grass can go over it. So notice this is just about maybe a 1/2 inch above grade. So plant considerations, we'll dive right in. Knowing your plant, we've all heard right plant, right place. Yes, that's absolutely true. We need to know how hardy they are. What are the attributes of interest? We want flower power, but we may have interesting foliage. You've seen textures, fall colors, ornamental bark, colorful stems, fruiting. There's so many elements. So knowing what the plant offers, and hopefully over multiple seasons of interest, is important. What do they need for care? It becomes important. So the reverse expectation is simply you have an expectation that the plant will thrive for you and perform, sometimes without knowing what it really needs. But that plant is expecting that you do know what it needs in terms of lighting, soil, watering, etc. So, in this case, here's an ash tree. I think this one is now gone. But I'm looking at this landscape, and now vinyl edging, there's some fabric in there. In this case, some spireas that have been cut back. But knowing what you're dealing here with soils and exposure becomes important, and what you can potentially do with the space. With plants, the color is important. Here's autumn crocus with marigolds. But don't forget non-living color. You've seen a lot of plants in the talk already, and plant talks could be their own thing. But that blue is just sparkling in that area, those Adirondack chairs. So the hot colors really draw the eye, the oranges, yellows, and reds, but don't neglect those blues, greens, and maroons as cooler contributors. And whites and silvers need to be incorporated, in everything. Texture becomes important, and in my mind's eye, I'll think of an image or a setting in black and white and think about bold and fine textures. And the fact that many of our plants that also offer great flowers or fragrance or foliage color have really cool texture as well. So here's a bright composition, very hot colors. There's that tiger eye sumac on the left, some rudbeckia. Notice the use of the non-living element there, the colorful upright obelisk amongst some grasses. And your eye is immediately drawn right to that golden elderberry in the center. And don't worry about the plant names as I say them, but that golden elderberry was positioned knowing that purple filbert behind it would be a nice foil. And I guarantee that blue salvia in the foreground knew it would play off of that gold in May quite nicely. And this is a snippet in time. This is May, so there's other things that haven't bloomed. There's other things happening. Notice in the foreground, you're seeing a little hint of lamb's ears. So this is a deep elaborate border, but it's addressing seasonality, but also the colors of both flower and foliage are playing off each other. So create the framework first. I like to consider where my primary plants will go. We have a tendency to overplant, so there's no reason you can't do it in stages, and that certainly helps the budget. We've talked about harmony. Maybe we have a design theme or we're trying to include a harmonious situation with the repetition of plants. Progression of color for sure. You should have 12 months of color. Yes, we have April through October, November for our earliest blooms to our latest fall color, but we should be looking upon a winter season with colorful stems, interesting conifers, ornamental bark, fruits, etc. But do garden in those 3 dimensions. So proper plant choices are critical, absolutely. And I apologize for the speed, but a lot of this is also on your handout. Don't forget the cool colors can offer a depth in a smaller garden, but those splotches of bright color really are great accents. Here, that golden aconi grass and that golden hosta draw the eye, but they're just bits of a combination there. Warm colors with coarse texture like that grass in the foreground combines well with darker plants. So again, it's not figuring out a composition like I need to come up with 12 plants that go well together. You start coming up with 1 or 2 that play off each other and you start expanding from there. So again, it's fun playing with it. And your plant palette expands. Some of you are new gardeners. Don't be intimidated by the fact that there's so many plants out there. You should be excited by it, but do your due diligence. Simple coral bells with this golden aconi grass, this dusky brown with this gold. Very simple along a path edge. A little blurry here, but notice a very chartreuse theme landscape. This is not my image, by the way, but notice how the furniture even ties into some of the landscape, which includes non-living elements. The glazed ceramic ball there, there's some statuary. I love ferns, but the nuances of that Japanese silver painted fern there. Your eye, as I talk here, is traveling through a lot of texture. You're seeing 0 flowers, no flowers in this image, but lots of interest. So again, consider foliage. In the foreground, that variegated iris already bloomed blue in spring, and that maroon sedum is going to be blooming pink here in about 2 weeks. So here's 2 plants that have been hanging out looking great together. They go through their bloom periods in spring and then the other one in fall, but their foliages look dynamite for 7 months of the year together. And whether it's perennials like this or woody plants or even your annuals, mix it up and do consider foliage for its color, the nuances of texture, glossiness. There's all sorts of things to keep in mind. The glossiness of ligularia in the landscape. Notice the repetition of gold in this partly shaded border. Lots of things happening here, but the gold repetition all the way in the distance there. And bold textures, and I could rattle these off, but for the sake of time, I won't. But we have a subtropical look in a Midwestern garden based on getting bold foliage plants and combining them with finer texture. And here's a shade garden image with very few flowers, but look at all the textures. I think the linchpin in this is this golden sedge in the lower left, that grassy-like plant, offering fine texture and a splash of gold. So that punctuation, offering interest, it's not just tiered plantings on our foundation or along the back fence, not just short, medium, and tall things. Mix things up. Don't be predictable. Add height and interest and punctuation to engage the eye. Break it up. This little border separating these 2 chairs, look at what they're doing there. That's kind of fun. There's a banana off left there. So not all hardy plants, but in this case, both hardy woody plants, and there's that Abyssinian banana again. So this is right up on a border right in the front. So they said, I'm not going to do low plants and taper back. These are going to be right in your face. And other examples. So I'm not trying to sell you on expensive tropical plants, but the concepts are the same. And as we get near the end here, that energy efficient thing, it could be its own topic, but in essence, here's a sugar maple in fall. They say those who plant a tree consider more than themselves, or they're planting it for their grandchildren. That sugar maple's 200 years old. They do so many great things for us, but they also purify the air and properly placed around our residences, particularly east and west sides of the building. A nice schematic from the Morton Arboretum. North is to the top of the image. So what you're seeing is trees on the east and west are shading the windows, both in the morning and then afternoon. So the type of species you select, distance from the house, its mature size, that there's research on all of that. The question comes up, why wouldn't I put trees in the south? You absolutely can, but and peak summer months, the sun's directly overhead at noon. So shadows are fairly straight downwards. So it's not overly easy to shade south facing windows in summer. So east and west become important. And again, there's a whole science behind this, but it's that shady respite we want. We want to be out in these spaces. We want to engage them. Shade the air conditioner, by the way, it increases efficiency. Just having some plants around this or a little fence would be helpful. Wildlife in the garden, this tired squirrel. We're not again planting for deer or damage. It happens in our landscape, but pollinator friendly gardens with plant selection, less chemical use. There's so many things we can do for our native pollinators and what we term desired wildlife. The birds we want to bring in, et cetera. And I've been in a battle with deer in my public gardens for years, and I just don't lose any sleep over it anymore. I just can't. So in summary, consider function. How are you going to use this landscape? Keep in mind those principles of design, assessing your site, knowing what you have, but strive for that cohesiveness. And that's not a one-time thing. You're striving for that constantly. And that includes editing. It's not just putting things in the landscape. It might be removing or modifying. Don't forget budget and accommodating for maintenance, and get the kids involved, for gosh sakes. It's so important. Absolutely vital. My daughters are 36 and almost in 26, and they're both gardeners, and we were happy we started them young. As we wrap it up, and we'll take 10 minutes for questions or more. This is on your handout, but do feel free to jot down my email if we don't get to a question you think of later tonight, or if we don't get to it tonight, because I did go a little over. I was waxing poetic on a lot of things, but I've enjoyed speaking with you. This is my daytime gig. This is the Healing Garden. I designed this in 2010. It's a 3-acre all accessible space behind Edgerton Hospital, which is a very small rural critical care hospital. It's used for therapy, Tai Chi, yoga, physical therapy. It's open to the public, very sensory focused, raised beds. It's a whole lot of fun, and it's primarily volunteer maintained. And we have a lot of fun out in that space. And with that, I'll say thank you. And I'm going to turn it back to Catherine to manage questions. But I appreciate your time, folks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was really great. So many beautiful pictures, and there's way more that goes into landscape design than I could have thought. So thank you so much for that intro.
You bet.
Um, let's just jump right into questions. Can you recommend some specific native plants that do well in the Chicagoland area?
Wow. Well, there's a lot. And that's why if you're in the Chicagoland area, that's when you go out to Chicago Botanic and Morton Arboretum and Cantini Garden and all the wonderful places and garden centers, and you chat with them. And what's exciting to see in the retail setting is a heavier predominance of native plants. So there's hundreds and hundreds of from woody plants to perennials. Your situation will dictate what you're looking for if you have clay soils versus wet versus dry. So get a little more guidance based on your situation, but do know there are some great resources in the Chicago area. You're blessed with some of the best garden centers in the Midwest, so take advantage of it, and public gardens.
What material is the most durable for planters that stay outside all winter?
Yeah, a great question. I get that often. One thing I would say is I universally remove the soil from every container, because the real danger isn't so much winter temperatures as if there's soil and moisture within the container. Like think about terracotta. Terracotta breaks fairly easily. So not terracotta. Ceramics aren't great unless they're totally emptied and dried out. And so I tend to empty everything out and flip it over so they don't accumulate moisture. There's some great developments in what are termed hybrid concretes, and also fiberglass containers that have a little bit of flex to them. So if there's not a reason, to me, there's not a reason to maintain soil in them. So you do want to clean and sterilize them, but go into some of the more modern material containers, these hybrids and fiberglass, and plastics are pretty good too. And most of the plastics, by the way, are now phyto protected. In the past they would get brittle with a couple of years of sun, and now they essentially have sunscreen, so they last a lot longer. So cost is always an indicator of the quality of a container, so keep that in mind as well.
You used the word foil a lot. What does that mean?
Yeah, great question. So it's foil is essentially a backdrop. So when I alluded to so that shot of the deep border, that purple filbert was a foil, was a backdrop for that golden elderberry. And subsequently, that golden elderberry became the backdrop or foil for that blue salvia in front of it. So a foil is essentially a neighboring element. It can be a color or a texture or what have you. So they essentially are good buddies. So I alluded to foils against the facade of a house. That maroon house, a great foil for a maroon house would be golden shrubbery. So take advantage of those backdrops.
Okay, next question. What tips do you have for thinking about plants for seasonality?
Yeah, seasonality. The first thing I would do is address lack of seasonality. So go out into your winter garden these next couple of weeks and see if it's pretty dull and drab. And granted, winter is our least interesting season. We're all a little bit of drudgery with the browns and grays and such. But look where there might be lapses where you could have interesting stem color or what have you. But then do spring, summer, and fall as well. So you may go out in your spring garden in May and be like, it's not real exciting. Then you consider, you know what, I'm going to plant bulbs in fall to address my spring lapse. And then in summer, if you're missing something, you go out to the garden center and you start addressing it. It's not just gaps. You might be missing a color you want or a texture. So the best way to address seasonality is to identify lack of seasonal interest and then plan accordingly. If you get plants with multiple seasons of interest in that same square footage, that's a slam dunk. And I'm rambling here, but I love a peony because of that 2 to 3 weeks of awesomeness in spring. But after that, it's just kind of a floppy mess. But I can dedicate space to a peony. But if I can dedicate that same real estate to something with awesome spring flowers, maybe interesting fruiting, fragrance, fall color, and there are plants that have multiple seasons, you get more bang for the buck and you can address the same space over myriad seasons.
Any books that you would recommend to learn more about design?
Hmm. Ooh, wow. Yeah. I can't say that I'm real current with. See, so many of the books are written for a wide audience. So when they get into plant materials, it gets a little bit goofy because they're addressing a nationwide audience. So non-hardy plants for us. Going back to my earlier comment, the plants are to me the last consideration. So in terms of design elements, um, boy, I have to say I'm really drawing a blank, at least on a modern offering. I bet your library, Catherine, has some awesome books on design. Yeah, great question. I can't offhand. I can't recommend anything at this point. I feel it's attending lectures and in-person things like this is your best approach, to be honest.
Do you have any plant recommendations for privacy and noise mitigation?
So privacy and noise mitigation, the issue is you rely on hedges because in most cases fences aren't effective enough. So in terms of hedging, arborvitae, as common as they are, quick growing and quick to establish in terms of a hedge. And there's a wide range of habits, narrow ones, those that get only a certain height. There may be some maintenance down the road in terms of shearing and such. If you have deer, you don't want to deal with arborvitae simply because they're tasty to deer, but there's a wide range of hedge materials and that are out there, but you'd want to lean into evergreens for year round. That year round at least sound screening.
Can you recommend what types of plants to think of planting since our summers are getting hotter and drier?
Mm. Yeah, thankfully the landscape industry is starting to address that with their plant breeding and what they're offering in our areas. The days of planting super needy plants are ending, and that's not to say they're not still available. What I mean by that is plants that are need a lot of TLC, frequent watering, etc. The fact that we're having some brutal summers, periodic droughts. 2024, we had a super cool and really damp spring into midsummer. So that was a kind of a curveball. So it's tough to recommend specific plants because the other factors include what you have for soil and sunlight and such. But I guarantee going to your local garden centers or nurseries or talking to proven landscape professionals and mentioning some of your concerns along with your situation, your setting, they'll offer some great things. But drought tolerance is a huge thing that's coming up, and they're developing more plants for us in the Midwest.
Do you have any do's or don'ts for rain barrels?
Yeah, so I have two rain barrels outside my home. And for those that don't know what these are, in essence, we're collecting rainwater off the roof. It drains down into these barrels, and then I can utilize that water for something else. And by the way, it doesn't take a lot of rain on the surface area of a roof to fill barrels. The do's and don'ts, you want to use it fairly often. You don't want to have the water sitting there for any great length of time. If you haven't installed them yet, elevate them because you want gravity flow. You want to put them up on blocks or elevate them so you get some gravity flow. And you have to have clearance for your watering cans or a hose attachment. So I've learned this the hard way. So mine are elevated about 3 feet for some additional gravity. Empty them out in winter, totally. You don't want the freezing and thawing. So the maintenance of all the tubes and ports and parts and nozzles and et cetera becomes important. There's a lot of videos on how to make your own rain barrels and how to properly use them. I will say that 10 years ago, there was a concern that using water off your roof was bad for vegetables, meaning some of that detritus and other bird poop and other things from your roof would affect the vegetables. And I believe, with the exception of cedar roofs, that have been treated, they've found that it's not detrimental. But I have to say, I use my rain barrel water on my vegetables, and I'm not too worried about it. But rain barrels, there's so many references on their proper use. You get additional information beyond what I'm rambling about right now.
Okay, it doesn't look like we have any other questions. Let me just double check, see if anything has come in. Doesn't look like it. So if you think of any other questions, please feel free to email Mark. His email is on the handout, or you can always reach out to me and I can pass something on to him. So I just want to thank you so much, Mark, for your presentation and for your time. And thank you all who attended and asking your great questions. It's always great when people have questions. And I hope everyone has a good evening.
Great. Good night, everyone.